Talking to fellow cruisers and swapping stories at sundowner meetings at bars and on boats revealed very different experiences during the 900-mile voyage to the Galapagos from Panama. Motoring and light winds predominated, with the occasional squall, but the wind direction varied considerably. In the true spirit of adventure, our trip was the most bizarre. Poco Andante left Panama and motored for 3 days with the occasional glimpse of whales and dolphins to break the monotony. Heading for the recommended 84 degrees west crossing of the equator, just south of Marquesas Island, we encountered a strong easterly current that forced us south into the cold Humboldt Current. Thermals and fleeces on, despite being in the tropics, and no wind. Poco's motoring speed over the ground dropped to 2 to 3 knots. We were going through fuel like there was no tomorrow, and we were getting nowhere. We decided to turn west to get back onto our run line. It was like hitting a wall. Speed dropped yet again, and it became evident that we were not going to have enough fuel to cover the last 400 miles to the Galapagos. With only enough fuel remaining for emergencies, we decided to wait for wind. The engine was turned off and sails set in the 4 to 5 knot headwind. We quickly came to a complete standstill. Looking at our GPS, you could see that we were actually going backwards at 4 knots, heading east, totally the wrong direction. The decision had been made for us. We were being swept towards the coast of mainland Ecuador in this unusual ocean current. A quick look at the chart and consulting Jimmy Cornell's World Cruising Handbook, we noted that Esmeraldas, about 150 miles away, was a likely place to buy fuel. Turning Poco around, we were now speeding along at 7.5 knots and only 4 to 5 knots of wind. We covered the distance in double quick time and arrived off Esmeraldas at dawn the next day, flying our Q flag to indicate that we were not intending to check in. As Poco approached the well-buoyed river entrance, we frantically searched for a fuel dock, without much joy. There was a local fisherman out on the river, so we held up an empty fuel can and shrugged our shoulders to indicate our plight, and he pointed to the fuel dock tucked away in the far corner of the fishing boat harbour. The dock didn't look very inviting to tie up to, so we decided to anchor in the middle of the harbour. Luckily, an enterprising local, Ernaldo, was quick on the scene with his dugout canoe. He then paddled Keith ashore with 9 empty jerry cans. While Keith was gone, local officials decided to visit Poco Andante, wanting me to complete entry formalities. It was Good Friday. The possible delay and overtime costs made me reluctant to stay. In order to delay proceedings, I offered coffee and beer, which seemed to work, and I spoke about how beautiful their country appeared, desperately hoping Keith would return. My charm must have worked. They agreed to give us 3 hours to complete refuelling. About an hour later, Keith returned with 9 full jerry cans, which only left about 20 centimetres of freeboard on the canoe. Unloading was a very precarious operation. Unfortunately, one trip wasn't enough to fill our tanks, so Keith was off again, and finally we had a second load. We gave Ernaldo a well-deserved $10 tip, and we were ready to leave. We'd only been about 2 hours. The tide was rushing out, so we were keen to leave before it got too low. I was patting myself on the back for a quick turnaround and headed out of the fishing harbour and carefully lined up the leading marks heading for the open sea. When suddenly Poco came to an abrupt halt in the middle of the channel. We'd hit mud. Full power in reverse and a quick prayer pulled us off. After some frantic hand signals with another passing fisherman, he pointed us to deep water, and Poco carefully crept over and back towards the Galapagos. 3 days later, we crossed the equator for the first time. Keith toasted Neptune with a beer and I with a tot of rum. The following afternoon, while Keith was off watch and having a siesta, I was in the cockpit and heard thump 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 sound coming from a long way off. Considering Poco Andante was hundreds of miles from anywhere, it seemed rather strange. Slowly a dot appeared on the northern horizon, gradually getting larger. I hastily prepared for visitors by putting on a top and got hold of the handheld VHF radio. Eventually, a helicopter appeared above, large and white, with US Navy painted on the sides. Its side door was open and a huge telephoto lens was pointed at Poco. Considering we were in international waters and flying the correct ensign, it seemed very intrusive. Rather annoyed, I called them on the VHF radio on channel 16. US Navy, this is British sailing yacht Poco Andante. Can I be of assistance? Rather cheeky. To their credit, they did respond saying that they were in the area. Later on, we figured that they must have been on a naval warship just over the horizon and had seen us on radar and were checking us out, or else they were just out for a jolly. The rest of the trip was uneventful, and luckily our diversion to Esmeraldas allowed us to skirt the foul current. Poco's adventures and 300-mile detour had been relayed to other yachts on the same passage via regular links on the SSB radio. They were very thankful and chose different routes and avoided the strange current. We believed they were caused by the El Niño effect that year. In the end, we were at sea for 11 days and covered 1,175 nautical miles for a trip that should have been much shorter. Galapagos, one of the treasures of the known world, welcomed us. Wreck Bay on San Cristobal was a lovely, safe anchorage. You could see most of the wildlife that the Galapagos is famous for here. There was an anchoring charge for yachts whose gross registered tonnage is greater than 10 tons. Poco Andante was registered at 19.35. We paid $150 and could stay as long as our visa allowed. In order to protect and conserve the unique nature of the Galapagos Islands, it was only possible to go sightseeing as part of organised tours. The crew from another yacht joined Keith and I for an excursion inland with guide Fernando. We thoroughly enjoyed the trip to the Tortoise Sanctuary, to a volcano lake with flights of frigate birds overhead, and to the coast where marine iguanas and huge sea lions blazed about on the black volcanic rocks. During the passage to the Galapagos, Keith had lost a filling in one of his molars, so the search was on for a dentist. While walking up the hill towards the supermarket with Rob and Gemma from Orinoco Flow, we saw a sign for a dentist. The building looked clean and tidy, but the front gate, which was a grill, was shut. While we peered at the sign to determine the opening hours, a young woman rushed towards us from a bar across the road. It turned out she was the dentist and offered to see Keith there and then. So the rest of us continued to the supermarket and said we'd call back on our return. But Keith caught up with us about 30 minutes later. He'd already had the filling replaced at a total cost of $20. The workmanship was obviously of a very high standard, as the filling has never required any further attention. While still at Wreck Bay, Keith put on his scuba gear and cleaned the barnacles off the bottom of the boat, and really enjoyed the company of the playful and inquisitive sea lions who visited. They just loved to show off their underwater skills and were very playful, blowing bubbles in your face, doing backflips and somersaults. Needless to say, the bottom took a long time to get scrubbed. A quick explore around our anchor also showed Keith the wonderful variety of sea life, including a 2-metre wide stingray. The sea lions liked to sunbake, and the boats with sugar scoops at their stern sometimes ended up with 3 of these enormous creatures lying on the steps. Although picturesque, the smell they left behind was not welcome. We had one sunbathing on one of the tubes of our rib, warmed by the sun, precariously balanced on one side and miraculously staying on even when another boat went past, creating a wash. It was amazing how they got up there just using their fins and tails. Galapagos certainly lived up to its reputation of being a haven for wildlife. Rob and Gemma from the yacht Orinoco Flow were keen to do some diving and organised a day out on a local boat for themselves and Keith. During their dive, they saw hammerhead sharks, turtles, seals, sea lions and other tropical fish. all against a colourful backdrop of marine lichen painting the underwater walls of the island. After a week on San Cristobal, we sailed overnight to Puerto Villamil on Isla Isabela. Isabela was beautiful, a peaceful anchorage, and blue-footed boobies abound. With giant tortoises wandering around, the Galapagos penguins perched on the rocks about 300 metres away and occasionally swam past the boat. Penguins, tame bird life, and of course the unique marine iguanas. The local sea lions were huge, but not as playful as the ones on San Cristobal. We explored Isabela together with two couples from two other yachts. After about an hour in a truck, we reached the slopes of Sierra Negra, an active volcano still steaming after erupting the previous year. We then mounted horses for another hour, heading around the rim and towards Volcano Chico, a lava flow from 1979, and walked across this barren moonscape for a view to the north of the island. We also explored the El Muro de las Lágrimas, Wall of Tears, one of the most important historic sites in the Galapagos Islands. The history of the Wall of Tears is not a nice one. The wall was built over 14 years, back in the 1940s and 1950s, by prisoners who were sent to Isabela Island. The establishment of a penal colony here was an easy choice for authorities, as they knew it was virtually impossible for anyone to escape from the remote island. As for the wall itself, it was built by the inmates by hand. Out in the sweltering heat, they would collect the heavy, sharp lava rocks from around the island and place them along the wall. Some people say the wall was never finished, as it was meant to be a wall that would surround the actual prison area. But it is more likely that this was simply a make-work project as punishment for those sent here. No real purpose to create this long, tall wall in the middle of nowhere, other than to make the prisoners suffer. Another day, a group of about 4 or 5 yachts got together and hired a powerboat for a breathtaking trip along the coast to Cabo Rosso, weaving at high speed through the lava tunnels and channels to a lagoon where we snorkeled with green turtles and penguins. On the way back, we saw a pair of manta rays flying through the air, really magical. The passage from the Galapagos Islands to the next island group in the Pacific, the Marquesas, would be our longest, about 3,000 nautical miles. The sailing would be long and hard. Each boat developed its own strategy. The main influence was the position of the South Pacific High and the location of the ITCZ, Intertropical Convergence Zone. We had the benefit of our Inmarsat-C, which gave us a daily update of these weather systems. We decided that we would sail west for 3 days and then take a more southerly course to pick up more wind. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned, and we ended up becalmed for several days. We were soon joined by a school of mahi-mahi, glorious creatures with their golden and blue scales. They sheltered in the shade of the hull, As well as looking superb, they also taste fantastic. We also made the mistake of keeping our sails up to try and pick up any wind that there might be. We believe this actually resulted in UV degradation to the sails and chafe as well. In the end, we succumbed and motored north for a day and picked up some more easterly wind that drove us steadily westwards. At this time of year, which was March, April, May, there was a steady stream of boats crossing the Pacific, most of which kept in touch via an informal SSB radio net. This entailed checking in with that day's net controller on a pre-agreed frequency at a pre-arranged time. You gave them your position, weather, course and speed. When all the boats have checked in, you can then call up other boats for a chat about fishing, recipes, etc., or tap into the expertise of the cruising community if problems arose. 3 of the yachts crossing the Pacific that year had children on board, and a separate quiz was held for them to coincide with their homeschooling. They had to learn how to say hello, thank you, goodbye, yes and no in the language of the next group of islands they were going to. They also had to speak their answers on the SSB radio. Nancy and Molly on the catamaran Jade spoke Mandarin as their first language and English as their second language. Arnie, their father, is English and their mother, Cam, is from Hong Kong Chinese. The 2 young Chinese girls had become really good friends with the blonde-haired 6-year-old twins Marita and Hedda from the Norwegian boat Blue Marlin. It was delightful to hear the youngsters speaking on the radio. English is the official language for ship-to-ship communication. Molly and Nancy, the Chinese girls, taught Marita and Hedda their favourite Mandarin nursery rhymes, and at various islands across the Pacific, they'd jump up and down on Jade's catamaran's trampoline, chanting the songs. In general, the mothers were involved with teaching the curriculum while the fathers took watch. The formal schooling usually only occupied mornings. When they were ashore, the afternoons were spent following up on their particular interests with educational guidance from the parents. The benefits the children were gaining from the family's experience were invaluable. The kids were polite and sociable beyond their years. They played together well and enjoyed learning about their world. The long crossing was not without its dramas. The skipper of one of the yachts suffered complications following surgery he'd had in Ecuador before departing to cross the Pacific. His condition worsened and they put out a mayday call. Luckily, a passing freighter on its way to Tahiti made a detour and the man was taken on board. But his wife had to stay with the yacht as there was the only 2 of them on board. She had to continue to the Marquesas and then on to Tahiti single-handed. What they did was one of the other yachts, which was about the same size, which meant that their sailing speed was about the same, stayed within visible range of her. At night, she would put the yacht on autopilot and get some sleep, and the other yacht would keep a lookout. Quite scary. But it did emphasise how important it was that both of us knew how to handle the boat single-handed if necessary. I found it a struggle to raise the sails right to the full extent that Keith could, but I could actually get them up eventually. In another instance, one of the guys on a British boat suffered bad cuts to his hand when his fishing donut imploded after catching a large shark. They were on passage from Panama to the Marquesas, an estimated 42 days at sea, and they were still about 3 weeks from the Marquesas when the accident happened. Peter and Margaret diverted direct to the largest of the Marquesan Islands, Nukuhiva, where there was a hospital. Amazingly, a French neurosurgeon was on duty and was able to take a tendon graft from Peter's ankle to his hand. Remarkably, over time, he regained more than 90% use of his hand. Most boats suffered gear failure of some sort. We blew out the bottom end of our mainsail when hit by 40-knot squalls, but we put one reef in and were able to continue until we could make running repairs. The motor on our autopilot failed, worn brushes, during the first week. Luckily, we were able to rig the small emergency tiller pilot. However, this tiller pilot couldn't really cope while flying the Jenica, and so we had to rely on a poled-out genoa instead. The hydrovane self-steering didn't like direct downwind sailing. The hydrovane is that red thing at the back here. It's got a miniature sail all its own, and then down below the water that you can't see is an auxiliary rudder. First, you get the sails of the yacht really well balanced. That means that you're not having to move the steering wheel much to stay on course. And you tie off the main rudder, and you then set the hydrovane's red sail to the angle of the wind that you want the boat to steer, and the rudder on the one will help steer the boat. It's an art rather than a science. On the far left is the mainsail. The next one along is the genoa. The blue sail is like a spinnaker, and so when you're going dead downwind, you've got the 2 sails out and they catch the wind and help you go along. Gear failure was a constant worry. Our newly purchased swivel block at the end of the boom burst open. The watermaker didn't seem to be able to make water, and 2 carabiniere clips failed under the unrelenting forces, resulting in flogging sails. The ocean passages certainly took a toll on the gear as well as the crew. Overall, the weather was good. We had steady easterlies for the first 10 days and were becalmed for 2 days. This gave us time for a swim off the back of the boat, 1,500 miles from the nearest land. Diving off the back of the boat into unfathomable blue water is a unique experience, but as you can see, we had a safety line out. We also had visits from schools of dorados, dolphins and killer whales. We spotted one pod of around 10 killer whales about half a mile away swimming north. Surprisingly, 2 of the pod peeled off and came over to check us out. I think they realised we weren't edible and went back to the pod again. Not finding anything of interest, they continued on their journey. Their markings were amazing. Another yacht crossing the Pacific that year was Uterus. Benjamin and Henrietta are a young Norwegian couple who had sold up everything in Norway, driven down to Gibraltar and bought themselves a yacht with the aim of sailing around the world. They called the yacht Uterus, which we all thought must mean something else in Norwegian, but they explained that they had chosen the English name for 3 reasons. It was warm and wet, a place of safety, and C, the start of a new life. Their logo was a uterus with a small yacht inside. They were a really fun couple. 2 Norwegian yachts, Blue Marlin, the one with the twin girls on board, and Uterus, were sailing within sight of each other and decided to celebrate Norway's National Day together. Benjamin and Henrietta on Uterus left her under autopilot and dinghied across to Blue Marlin in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and lunched together on a Blue Marlin that they had caught earlier. We couldn't believe it. You have to have a lot of courage to actually leave your boat in the middle of the ocean, still with the sails up, and you have to have a lot of faith in your autopilot. The last few days were a little tiring, with a squall every hour or so. We had to be alert at all times and hand steer when the tiller pilot couldn't cope. At last, after more than 3,000 miles and 25 days at sea, we sailed into the stunning Marquesas. It was unexpected. I didn't expect them to be tall. You sort of think of Pacific Islands as flat with palm trees, but these were actually volcanic. Fatu Hiva was glorious, with tropical rainforest, trees laden with grapefruit, bananas, mangoes, etc. As far away from anywhere as it's possible to get, Fatu Hiva is a marvellous stop the world and get off kind of place. The iconic Bay of Virgins is one of the most dramatic anchorages in the world. So small that latecomers have to anchor in up to 30 metres of water. It's a case of first in, best dressed. After 5 days rest and recovery, we headed for the smallest of the inhabited Marquesas Islands, Tahuata. We had intended to stop at Bay Hanamoenanoa, but when we got there, it seemed to be full of boats. So we and Orinoco Flow decided to carry on to the next bay. They took lots of photos of us, which sort of shows what the sailing was like. It looked scary, but we were safe. Once we reached the anchorage, it was delightful and we had it to ourselves. There's relentless pressure to cross the Pacific before the next cyclone season. It makes it a long, hard sailing season, even though we had decided to wait it out in New Zealand rather than Australia. We had no time to linger. It was on towards Nuku Hiva. When we were a few miles off, there was a call on the VHF from one of the other yachts, a single-handed sailor without an engine, to say his dinghy had come adrift and could we keep a lookout for it. Amazingly, we spotted it, but by the time I called him on the VHF radio, we'd lost sight of it again. We gave him a rough idea of where we'd seen it. Once again, we peered out, trying to see a 2.5-metre grey object on a grey lumpy sea against a background of grey cliffs. It made us realise how remote the chances of seeing a man overboard would actually be. Eventually we spotted it again and were able to motor over and retrieve it. The painter had broken and was now down to about 1 metre or so long. We sailed really close to him and Keith was able to pass it over and we continued on our way. Bay Tahoe at Nuku Hiva was full of yachts taking advantage of the amenities the main town had to offer, but they were also waiting for a weather window for the long passage to the Tuamotus, the next island chain further across the Pacific. Nuku Hiva has some spectacular petroglyphs. All the boats crossing the Pacific ended up with a yellow sticky stain around the bows, presumably caused by bacteria or algae. Unless you scraped it off when it was still wet, it hardened and became really tough to remove. Cleaning it off was an arduous job that we all attended to upon arrival. And that's the boat that I told you about with the hand injury from the donut. He was actually in the hospital here, and the wife was on her own and she had a dicky knee. So a couple of other yachts came over and cleaned the hull for them. Very commendable practical assistance. The rolly anchorage was becoming unpleasant, but our departure for the Tuamotus was delayed by bad weather. There were SSB radio reports of strong gusts, blown out sails, and impassable entrances into the atolls, so we decided to wait for better weather. Desperate for a good night's sleep, we decided to nip around to Daniels Bay, about 5 miles to the west, where there was protection from swells. There was a slight lull in the weather, so we quickly weighed anchor and headed out. We still encountered 25-knot winds and large seas, but thankfully they were from behind and manageable. There was a yacht ahead of us, heading in the same direction, so we were playing follow my leader as we approached the entrance. Suddenly the yacht ahead of us turned around and headed back out to sea. Whether the entrance had scared him or for some other reason we'll never know, but it did make us more cautious. The entrance to Daniels Bay is tricky. We chose our wave, surfed in towards a steep cliff, and then made an acute right-hand turn into the lee of the cliffs. Similar to many harbours on the west coast of Portugal and Spain, they have the same problem. They've got the entire Atlantic fetch coming in, so they have the harbour walls to protect the harbours. As you come in, you have to make an acute turn either to left or right, but the opening has to be wide enough to allow the vessel in, so at some point you're broadside on to the waves until you get behind the harbour wall. Quite scary. Daniels Bay had become a waiting room. There were nearly 20 boats waiting for good weather, some running out of fresh supplies. The locals were very friendly and generous and would trade fruit for other items. After one visit for water, we ended up with a sack of pamplemousse, the really delicious extra large grapefruit. We got a hand of bananas plus some roasted nuts, variety unknown. We spent 5 days here. It was quite amusing. The bay was used by the American version of the TV program Survivor, about the exploits of a group of TV stars cast adrift on deserted islands. But it turns out there was an airport and civilization less than 5 miles away. The scenery was spectacular. Walks in the valley and a trip to the Vaipo waterfall at 350 metres, the third highest in the world, were a highlight. The weather finally moderated and a mass exodus of yachts headed for the Tuamotus. The Tuamotus is the largest group of coral atolls in the world. Each of the 78 atolls are similar. They are a low-lying ring of coral reef surrounded by a deep blue lagoon. 21 have one pass into the lagoon, 10 have 2 passes, and the rest have no passes at all. Variable currents, sudden storms and poor charts make cruising by yacht extremely hazardous. The seas were still confused after the 2 weeks of bad weather, but the wind was perfect. Under full sail, Poco Andante headed west 500 miles towards Ahe. Keith caught a huge fish on the way. You could see the mess it makes on deck. We would fillet the fish and freeze them and not put the fishing line out again until we'd eaten it all. Real hunter-gatherers. 4 days later, as we approached Ahe, we calculated that our ETA would be early evening. In the tropics there's no twilight, so darkness would soon fall. For safety, it's important to enter these atolls at slack water or with the following current, and preferably with the sun behind you so you can see the colour of the water. Good daylight is essential to avoid the numerous coral heads. Anchoring is an art. Fortunately, the coral atolls bring with them super clear waters, so we could actually see the hazards around. We always tried to ensure that the anchor lay in sand to prevent damage to the coral and to assist with good holding. We usually sought a depth of at least 5 metres, but as we approached a possible spot in which to drop the anchor, we would check that the turning circle didn't include any bommies, the large isolated coral upstands. Being prudent, we decided it would be too risky to enter Ahe. We altered course to Kauaihi, a little further west and south, and arrived early the next morning. This was a good move. The entrance was wide and easy, although the overfalls and countercurrents were a little unnerving. We had a restful few days here, snorkelling and chilling out. The snorkelling was excellent. We also joined a guided tour around the island by a local pearl farmer for all the cruises, the highlight being a high-speed ride in an open-topped ute complete with patio chairs for seating. There was only one good road, which was their new airport runway. Our tour driver was delighted to take the opportunity to get up some relative speed and took us on a drag run up the runway. We also had a tour around the empty new airport terminal, of which the locals were very proud. All this was a warm-up and sales pitch so we would buy lots of their world-renowned black pearls from him. The final stop was in the communal hall. We were served fresh coconuts, and the pearl trader emptied a briefcase full of pearls onto the table. We all then started to sort through them and gather together the raw pearls for creating necklaces, bracelets, earrings and rings. These were traded for bottles of rum, snorkeling gear, sunglasses, etc. Unsurprisingly, lots of the famous Polynesian black pearls changed hands and were squirreled away to make future creations. It turned out to be Midsummer's Day. This is a cause for celebration in Norway. Benjamin and Henrietta on Uterus organised a barbecue on a deserted motu, a palm-fringed small island at the west end of the atoll. The setting was lovely and the company great, with good snorkelling in the anchorage. After a couple of days, we moved to Whakarava, a day's sail away. Whakarava is the second largest atoll in the Tuamotus and is renowned for its snorkelling and diving. True to form, they were superb. A dive on the pass was a must. Keith dropped off in 30 metres of water and allowed the current to sweep him in towards the atoll. As the depth reached about 20 metres, he was met by a wall of sharks, stemming the current, waiting for the small fish to provide them with dinner. Amazing. Then the drift current dive took him along a multicoloured coral bottom with myriads of fish swimming against the current. In the lagoon, the snorkelling was equally beautiful, with healthy, well-populated coral heads, all at our anchorage just inside the pass. From Whakarava, we decided to go straight to Tahiti. We needed to prepare the boat ready for our next visitors, Carol and Trevor, my sister and her husband from New Zealand. It was a 2-day passage. We left late in the afternoon with a gentle 10 knots of breeze and the forecast indicating a gentle sail to Papeete. As ever, it never pays to be complacent. At 2 a.m. I was on the helm and Keith was asleep below. He responded to my shout, "Keith, the genoa's gone." He jumped out of bed and glanced at the wind speed as he donned his life jacket. It read 35 knots. I was battling with the helm, and sure enough the genoa was in tatters. First job, fill the remnants. Second job, drop the mainsail. Next, gather your breath and put the small staysail up. We settled the boat down and didn't see the wind drop below 30 knots for the next 36 hours. Averaging 7 knots even with the small sail, we made good time. But both suffered falls and bruises in the boisterous conditions and became exhausted, hand steering through the squalls. The approach to Papeete was easy through the main shipping channel and around towards the anchorage. We received a round of applause from our cruising friends as Poco paraded past, that they could see the state of our tattered genoa trailing strips of canvas from the furler, indicating the tough passage we had just endured. With relief, we anchored off Taiana Marina. It was lovely to be in Tahiti. There was an air of affluence with French influence everywhere, especially the large supermarkets, just a few minutes' walk away. These appeared to have been plucked from the heart of France, complete with all the produce. Heaven, but at inflated French prices. Our main task was to sort out the genoa, repair the autopilot and get the boat ready for visitors. One of the other cruisers came over to help us get the poor genoa down. You had to unfurl the tattered sail before you could get it down. I unpicked the UV strip, which had only just been recently fitted in Venezuela. It could be used on a new sail. Then Keith laid the dinghy alongside the yacht and we loaded the sail. It was so large that Keith could barely see over it. The sail was dumped unceremoniously in a rubbish skip at the marina. In its place, we fitted a Yankee sail to the furler. It's a sail very similar to the genoa, but cut higher at the bottom. In fact, reverting to a true cutter rig, Yankee and staysail, worked so well that we left it on until we reached New Zealand, where we had a replacement genoa made. The other item that needed attention was my supply of HRT, hormone replacement therapy. Since leaving the UK, I had been on patches, being unable to tolerate the tablet form. A friend in the UK posted 6 monthly supplies to me at a sorted place on our travels. But it was now becoming too difficult to arrange a supply to be sent to me in Tahiti. An alternative was to buy some locally. I visited a local pharmacy and in bad French explained my predicament. The pharmacist checked their books, but the HR patches were not available. In fact, they had no alternatives on offer. When I inquired what the local ladies used during menopause, the pharmacist gave a very Gaelic shrug. With no solution, I was going to have to go cold turkey. My sister and her husband, Carol and Trevor, duly arrived for their 2-week holiday. They had flown in from a very cold New Zealand winter and arrived to a warm and rainy Tahiti. After settling in, we planned a trip to the dance competition, part of the Bastille Day celebrations. It rained and rained. Thursday's competition was postponed to Tuesday. Saturday's was postponed to Thursday, a bit of a disaster for the organisers. This was not the normal balmy Pacific weather. One night was so blustery that it blew away one of the removable clear plastic cockpit side covers. As an escape, we had coffee and croissants at the local bar for breakfast and watched France versus Italy in the Soccer World Cup final. There was disappointment on the faces of the clientele when France was unlucky and lost on penalties. The multinational crowd made for a raucous fun time. Monday was brighter, so we left Tahiti and sailed to Moorea, an adjacent island which was the setting for the film version of South Pacific. An easy trip of 10 knots of wind. We anchored just inside the reef. Wednesday night was dance night at the next anchorage, so we moved into Cook's Bay and anchored off the Bali High Hotel and had a fun evening joining in with the tourists. Trevor had hired a car for a tour of the island. Visiting the sights and lookouts was a real treat for us. We then moved around the corner to Opunohu Bay. We had heard that the local stingrays were very tame and an early morning trip was planned, arriving before the tourists. Keith was armed with some squid to feed them. Little did he know that this was their number one favourite food. He was mobbed by these friendly creatures. Carol and I were not so sure, but took some great photos. It was also Brett from Interlude 3's birthday. An impromptu breakfast in the dinghies just off the beach to celebrate was sublime. The overnight sail to Huahine Nui was not the smooth trip we expected. Although it started off well, the wind came up unexpectedly. Just as we were about to eat dinner, a gust disrupted proceedings and we had to put a reef in the main. This flurry of activity was looked upon with trepidation by Carol and Trevor, but Poco Andante settled down and we had an easy but noisy sail arriving at dawn. We entered the reef and found a lovely anchorage off the beach. After breakfast, Keith zoomed to Whare, the local town, in the dinghy to get some fresh supplies. In the village, he saw an information board advertising a vanilla plantation in the next bay and decided that that would be worth a visit. We moved around there before breakfast the next day and took the dinghy ashore. Francois was a bit surprised to see 4 people walking up his drive on a quiet Sunday morning. However, he gave us a warm welcome and a great tour of his plantation. As well as vanilla, he showed us lots of native fruits. We came away with bags full of lovely tropical fruit and some fresh vanilla. The final hop to Raiatea was a gentle sail in 10 to 15 knots, and we tied up alongside the Apoiti Marina, ready for our guests to disembark and arrange their flight back to Tahiti. In the meantime, we hired a car and toured the island. The flowers were magnificent and the scenery delightful. Following a farewell dinner, we wandered into the local dance contest and were treated to a wonderful display of gyrating hips and colourful traditional costumes. It was a great finale to a lovely 2 weeks visit with Carol and Trevor. We had a few jobs to do, so we hung around Raiatea for a couple of weeks, enjoying the food and the company of fellow cruisers. The replacement motor for the autopilot arrived and seemed to solve the problem, thank goodness. The local sail loft let me use their sewing machine to make a replacement clear plastic panel for our cockpit. Work was delayed when the loft closed early to allow the ladies to rehearse each afternoon. Their village dance team had made it to the finals. We had enjoyed the dancing so much we went back for a second visit and cheered on our sewing ladies. We also booked tickets to see a dance troupe from Bora Bora, which is reputed to be the best in Polynesian. We had heard that a replica of Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki, captained by Heyerdahl's grandson, had just completed the trip from Peru to Raiatea and was due to land at the most sacred site in Polynesia. The Norwegian yacht contingent, Uterus, Necessity and Stormsvalen, were excited by this. We joined them early one morning to go out and meet Tangaroa, the Kon-Tiki too. It was an impressive sight. A balsa raft complete with satellite communication dome, wind and solar generators and other mod cons. Even more impressive was the Polynesian welcome they were given. More than 1,000 people participated in the traditional reception, starting with a welcome speech. The crew of the Tangaroa were garlanded with leis, the fragrance of the frangipane blooms wafted in the air. They listened respectfully to the harmonious singing which greeted them, and rubbed noses with the welcoming committee in the traditional Polynesian manner. After the religious blessings, they presented the high priestess with a stone carried from Peru. A piece of granite carried from Norway is a link to Kontiki expedition. The ceremony is meant to remind the population of times long gone, when guests brought stones to the great sacrificial grounds of Tapu Tapu Atia. The old temple ruin, Marae Tapu Tapu Atia, is the most important traditional temple in Polynesia. Regarded as French Polynesia's most sacred isle, Raiatea is the original cultural centre of the Polynesian islands. We found it interesting to see the marae, the focal point of Polynesian societies, and a place where their culture can be celebrated, being used in its traditional way, and that it was still a cornerstone of the island culture. It was heartwarming to see the same Polynesian welcome that would have been given to sailors of old. After the formalities, the marae came to life with traditional singing and dancing and feasting, the women wearing colourful dresses and the men in warrior garb. We departed Raiatea for the next islands along, Bora Bora, just a short morning sail. The fishing was successful. Keith caught a small tuna. The weather was fine and sunny, with little wind. We motor sailed most of the way. Arriving in good light, we anchored off a lovely reef for the afternoon. This is a tourist snorkeling spot, and most of the fish were accustomed to being fed. Keith took some scraps of tuna with him and was immediately mobbed by reef fish, angelfish, sergeant majors and many others. They were unafraid and taking scraps from his hand, a special experience. Bora Bora is said to be one of the most beautiful islands in the world. It is certainly dramatic with its rising peaks, perfect beaches and water every shade of blue. We had been impressed by the investment in navigation marks throughout French Polynesia, and the position of those in Bora Bora made navigation easy through the multiplicity of reefs. We celebrated the 3rd anniversary of our voyage in this idyllic setting. What a wonderful time we'd had so far. Sururo Atoll in the Northern Cook Islands was our next landfall, 700 miles away. It's a deserted atoll in the middle of the Pacific. Prior to departure, we made daily visits to the internet cafe for weather information. We didn't want a repeat of our last passage to Tahiti. We were extra cautious, or so we thought. The weather pattern in this part of the world is very complex. To the south, it's dominated by high pressures forming off Australia. These are often disrupted by low pressures pushing up from New Zealand. To the north is the intertropical convergence zone, the doldrums, and Bora Bora is squeezed between the two. This creates unpredictable strong winds and violent rainstorms. We were looking for a benign high pressure to form, which would hopefully give us a good trip. On 15th of August, we decided to set sail. The log entry read, "Decide to depart for Sururo Atoll. Hopefully weather okay. Forecast is for 18 to 20 knots for the first day or two, and then lighter, but swell developing from the south after 5 to 6 days. We enjoyed 2 days of great downwind sailing and had a lovely surprise to hear Orinoco flow on the SSB. It was great to make contact with Rob and Gemma again. They had spent a longer time at Tauau in Tuamotus and had been adopted by the families there, helping in the restaurant, and Rob, a surgeon, conducting minor surgery for some of the locals. We were expecting lighter winds, so weren't surprised when we were sailing close-hauled in 10 knots. This lasted about 24 hours, and then the wind dropped to nothing, but the rain started. Not in buckets, but in bathloads. Still no wind. The old sailor's adage of wind before rain, soon sailing again, rain before wind, sails to mend, was echoing through our minds. What's happening here, we wondered. Wham! The wind hit as if somebody had turned on a giant fan. It felt as though we were in the middle of a tornado. We hastily turned into the wind and Keith quickly dumped the mainsail and furled the Yankee. I steered into a downwind trajectory, and as the boat settled down on her course under engine, Keith reset the autopilot to take over the arduous task of helming. With no clear direction, all we could do was trust the autopilot and motor, hoping Poco Andante would sort herself out. This continued for a number of hours, well into the night. Wind speed was 40 knots, with 60+ knot gusts. Thankfully, the sea was reasonably flat. It appeared that the wind was so strong it was flattening the sea. Eventually, the wind dropped to below 30 knots and the direction became more consistent. We set a handkerchief-sized foresail and bowled along at 7 knots. The blustery conditions lasted through the day. Next morning, we were approaching the unmarked channel into Suro. Our entry coincided with a lull in the wind. However, this quickly changed to a 30-knot squall just as we entered the pass between the reefs. Thankfully, Graham from Minaret was watching our approach from the shore with his VHF radio. He talked us through the winding entrance and deteriorating visibility. There were about 20 yachts in the now tranquil anchorage. However, they too had witnessed the storm, but without benefit of sea room. 3 boats had snapped their anchor chains, and 1 was on the beach, hoping to float off with the next high tide. A few had suffered damage to their windlasses and bow rollers. Many anchor chains had been wrapped around the numerous coral heads that littered the anchorage. In hindsight, we were lucky to have been at sea during these conditions, but it was all worth it. Suro is a really special place. That afternoon, the wind cleared, and we ended up having a great 10 days in Suro. It's an isolated atoll, rectangular in shape with a turquoise blue central lagoon, some 19 kilometres long by about 8 kilometres wide. As a tropical island, it has everything one would expect. A surrounding coral reef with numerous islands dotted with coconut palms. The lagoon was teeming with fish and small sharks. Keith needed to attend to our masthead light and took a camera with him. You can see how daunting working at the top of the mast is, but the views of the atoll were amazing. Thousands of seabirds nest on this atoll, and turtles and coconut crabs abound. It was made famous by the recluse Tom Neale, who lived from 1902 to 1977, and wrote a book, An Island to Oneself. There is supposedly buried treasure here which is yet to be found. The real treasure is the natural diversity. The atoll, part of the Cook Islands National Park, was looked after by one Cook Island family, John, Veronica and their 4 sons, aged between 5 and 12. They were very welcoming and great company, always willing to take you out on their fishing and gathering trips. As custodians and caretakers, they spent 6 months a year there. They were dropped off at the start of the season with their supplies and taken home to Rarotonga at the end of the 6 months. With 4 growing lads, Veronica soon found out that her supplies were dropping fast, and they were reliant on cruisers to supply them with top-ups. Their potluck barbecues every 2 or 3 days were magical. The trips to the outer islands were worth every bit of the $50 national park entry fee. The visit usually included a trip to the nesting sites, and you could pay David Attenborough wandering around the millions of nesting birds. Frigates, terns, boobies and tropic birds, all unafraid of humans. In the lagoon, turtles abound, and sharks were constant companions. The main diet on the island is fish and coconuts, so fishing and coconut harvesting is a daily exercise. John was amazing, climbing 30-metre coconut palms to cut down the ripe coconuts. Whilst Veronica wove a basket from the palm fronds to carry them home. The coconut is an amazing product and can be used in a variety of ways. The green ones make a refreshing drink. The grated flesh of the brown ones is great for coating fish before cooking, and the spongy flesh from newly sprouting ones is great for making coconut pancakes, a Suro specialty. Chris from Magic Carpet entertained us all with his guitar. Several of the yachts had instruments on board. The evening jam sessions were great fun. Suro has no ciguatera, a neurotoxin which builds up in the flesh of reef fish and if consumed can make you ill. The fish was good to eat and plentiful. All you had to do was troll an attractive lure behind the dinghy and dinner was soon caught. However, it was difficult to control what you catch. One time Keith had a massive bite. The catch dragged the dinghy towards the reef. Keith motored into deeper water and slowly brought in the line, only to find a very unhappy grey shark on the end. It was half the length of the dinghy and not welcome aboard. He cut the line when it was waved it a relieved goodbye. Diving in the atoll is also excellent, and Keith went on numerous dives with Rob and Gemma on Orinoco Flow. The pass diving was great with lots of curious but harmless sharks. After a few days, the yachts that had been there for a week or so decided to leave. We were staying a bit longer. Unfortunately, when the boats tried to raise their anchors, some of their chains were wrapped around coral heads from the stormy winds of the previous week. We spent nearly all day snorkeling above each boat's anchor, directing the skippers where to turn to unwind the chain. Eventually they were all untangled and were able to depart. We had our own excitement when we came to raise our anchor. Keith was leaning over the pulpit, directing me which direction to turn to unwind our anchor chain from around the bommies, when his life jacket got caught in the lifelines and promptly inflated. The bang gave us a huge surprise before we collapsed in laughter. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. The 700-mile trip to Tonga beckoned. Orinoco Flow left, and the weather looking settled, we left the next day. The plan was to rendezvous at Rose Island, a small deserted atoll about 300 miles away, with a reputation for amazing diving. We had lovely 2 days of sailing. However, for the first time in 3 years, we both came down with a gastric bug, caught from one of the other yachts in Suvero. Wasn't much fun. The wind dropped on the third night, and we motored to try and catch up in the light winds. As dawn broke, the winds picked up and found us running in 25 to 30 knot winds with 3 to 4 metre seas. At 10 a.m, we were about 30 miles away from Rose Atoll and had a radio call from Orinoco Flow, relaying their harrowing experience trying to enter Rose Atoll. On arrival, they could see the seas crashing onto the reef and the calm water inside the atoll. They lined up the entrance to the pass and headed on in. Unfortunately, the outflow of water from the atoll was so strong that their engine failed to stem the current and began overheating. They decided to get out, but hit a coral head trying to turn around inside the pass. It was really frightening, but they got out okay and luckily with no damage to the yacht. With this news and the awful conditions, we decided to bypass Rose Atoll and head straight to Tonga. Orinoco Flow were heading to US Samoa. The remainder of our trip was a tough sail with lots of sails changing. After trying various sail combinations, we finally set our fluorescent orange storm trysail. This is a really small, loose-footed mainsail designed for storm conditions. We were delighted at how well the trysail performed and how much more comfortable the boat was. As the winds eased, we just altered our foresails to match the conditions. The most unlikely and colourful combination being the storm trysail with the Jenica. Through this passage, my menopausal symptoms were running rampant, hot flushes and raging emotional roller coasters. Keith would toss a bucket of seawater over me occasionally, but the extremes of emotions were distressing to both of us. The only good thing was that during the scary sailing moments, the adrenaline kicked in and overrode my menopausal temper. Our landfall in Vava'u was going to be a nighttime event. At 3 a.m, we motored through the wide pass using radar and moonlight and dropped anchor behind Minaret. We had contacted Graham on Minaret earlier by radio, and he gave us a precise Latin long to a sheltered and open bay with an easy entrance where they were anchored. Vava'u in Tonga is a mini archipelago with lots of limestone islands soaring out of pristine blue waters, all protected by a barrier reef. Hence there is wonderful sailing with many anchorages in flat water. The beaches are lovely and the snorkeling and diving excellent, with the added bonus that hundreds of humpback whales come here to calve and then mate each year. We had one amazing experience of whales breaching and putting on a display only metres from our anchorage. It was amazing to see and hear these magnificent creatures from the yacht. You could actually hear the whale songs, which was fantastic. Tonga is also a popular charter destination and there are lots of tourist-type facilities. The Tongans are your typical friendly Polynesians. In fact, Captain Cook nicknamed this group of islands the Friendly Isles. Tonga has a constitutional monarchy and the current succession goes back 1,000 years. Unfortunately, soon after we arrived, the king died and a month of official mourning was declared. Many of the Tongans dressed in traditional black with woven grass skirts on the outside, a sign of respect for the monarchy. All sports, matches, parties and concerts were cancelled. Luckily, before all that happened, we managed to attend the full moon party on a deserted island. All the yachts took their dinghies to the island and were met on arrival by boat boys who would take the dinghies out to anchor them for you. The beach itself was shaped like a natural amphitheatre, formed by a small extinct volcano. The ground was covered in pumice, which had floated up from an active volcano somewhere on the seabed. With all the dinghies, the bay looked like a busy car park, and at the end of the evening we were amazed how they recognised which dinghy belonged to which crew. The party involved a pig on the spit and the consumption of far too much alcohol, good music and lots of dancing. The Tongans are also very religious and have great singing voices, and a visit to church on Sunday was a most enjoyable experience, with amazing harmonies coming from the congregation. Even though we couldn't understand a word, the effect was very uplifting. Amongst the yachties, the social scene continued with regular parties, barbecues and get-togethers. Compared to French Polynesia, eating out was affordable again. Tonga is also a place where we left many of our friends. Those who had decided to go to Australia still had a lot of miles to cover, whereas those who were heading down to New Zealand for the cyclone season could linger a while. We were in the latter group and could spend another week or so in Tonga before taking the short hop to Fiji. The protected anchorages were great for attending to boat maintenance and chores. Keith still bore the scars of the Aerogen wind generator blade that had cut his arm and decided to tackle its repair. Not the arm, the Aerogen. A complete rebuild, including new bearings, gave it a new lease of life. On October the 7th, we left Tonga for the 3.5-day passage to Fiji, flanked by 2 pods of humpback whales. The sea around the Lau group, part of Fiji, was covered in a layer of tan-coloured pumice covering hundreds of square miles, the aftermath of a new island erupting between Tonga and Fiji. It had been reported that the layer was up to 1 metre thick and had abraded hulls and blocked engine intakes. Some of the football-sized lumps made ominous noises as they collided with the hull. There was no way to avoid sailing through the area, but we were just pleased that it was slightly less dense as we passed through compared with a few days earlier. We also crossed the 180-degree meridian line. You can see the change from west to east. The rest of our sail to Suva was a gentle broad reach, a welcome respite from strong winds. We had timed our arrival for dawn. The entrance through the Coral Pass is very narrow, but we had been informed that the blue leading lights made the entrance easy. An hour before sunup, the moon disappeared as an enormous black cloud passed before it. The rain came down in sheets, followed by 30 knots of headwind. Down came the sails and on went the engine. We were just outside the pass searching for the leading lights. They were nowhere to be seen. I radioed harbour control to check whether there was a problem. No, came the reply. You just can't see the lights because the cloud is so low. I had plotted our course through the pass and into the harbour, and Keith was on the helm. He spotted a fishing boat, which he presumed was in the pass, so headed towards the boat. I happened to notice the depth sounder was reading 5 metres, a little shallow for a main shipping channel. After a rather loud conversation, Keith eventually realised that the fishing boat that he was heading towards was actually aground on the reef. Oops. Helm hard to starboard. A close shave. Fiji has inherited its bureaucratic ways from its colonial past. Endless forms to be completed by hand, in triplicate, none of which seemed to be particularly relevant. Armed with his big stamp, the official stamped the form, handed 1 copy back to us, and added the rest to one of the tall, dusty piles of paper at the rear of his office. Never to be seen again, I suspect. Suva's weather was wet and windy nearly every day we were there. The shopping was good and the market excellent, with fresh fruits and vegetables. You could also stock up on kava here. Kava is the local drink made by steeping ground kava roots in water. It tastes a little like sawdust, but has a slight kick. It's still the custom to present a gift of kava when visiting a local village. Following a welcoming ceremony, the chief gave you permission to visit his village or island. It was good to carry a supply just in case. Our prime reason to visit Fiji was to arrange checkups for both our teeth and our eyes. We had been told that the medical facilities were excellent and inexpensive. Most of the practitioners had been trained in Australia or New Zealand. Our cruising guide recommended a particular dentist in Suva. We arrived at the address, which was in an upstairs office. When we inquired about dental appointments, the receptionist burst out laughing. "This is the HIV STD clinic. The dentist has moved. Don't worry, I can show you the way." As it was lunchtime, we offered to take her to lunch on the way. She was delighted and took us to a restaurant serving local cuisine and introduced us to Fijian cooking. The less said about that, the better. As we walked along the high street, she was often greeted by passers-by who gave us knowing looks, which we found embarrassing. It was worrying how many people seemed to know her, hopefully not in her professional capacity. The dentist was most obliging and we were able to get appointments that day. The optician was a very trendy young man with immaculate hair. As well as getting new glasses for Keith, we also asked for a recommendation for his hairdresser. I had been cutting Keith's hair for a year or two, but felt as I had lost the plot with his hairstyle. The barber hairdresser was great and allowed me to sit on a stool to watch the proceedings and gave me some tips. Really helpful. With teeth cleaned and new glasses, we hung around Suva waiting for the weather to abate. Suva Yacht Club was great for hanging out and had good facilities. It is one of the departure points for New Zealand, and discussions about weather windows were commonplace. On a morning report on the Rag of the Air, it's the cruises SSB network for the South Pacific, there was a request for assistance by a Kiwi yacht, Ranganui, which had damaged its rudder in 40-knot winds. They had decided to turn back and head for Suva. Just outside Suva Harbour, their engine failed and they were taken under tow by an American yacht. Keith went out in our rib to help steer them through the pass and tow them into the marina for repairs. They had spent 6 days in 40+ knots of wind, hand-steering their jury-rigged rudder most of the time. They were very relieved to reach Suva. Eventually the weather did ease a little, so we checked out of Suva. Again, probably the most bureaucratic procedure anywhere. It was about 100 miles to Musket Cove, with the need to check in at Lautoka, a 30-mile detour to the north. The gentle sail didn't last long. It turned into a brisk 25 knots. We anchored behind Yanaka Island for the night and hunkered down. Originally, we had intended a gentle 3-day passage stopping out on the way. Heading out the next morning, the fresh easterly turned into 35 knots with relatively flat seas, so under Yankee alone, we covered the next 70 miles in double quick time. We anchored just inside Navula Pass, and the next day made our way up to Lautoka to check in. Cruising is full of lovely surprises, the breathtaking sunsets, the joy of seeing dolphins playing, and the excitement of new places. Hard to beat is the heartfelt meeting of old friends. The trip to Lautoka was one of these. A call on the radio brought us in touch with 3 ships again. We had last seen them in Gibraltar 3 years earlier, when they had encouraged us to cross the Atlantic and keep sailing. Needless to say, it was fun to meet up with them again. After checking in at Lautoka, another mammoth exercise, we headed to Musket Cove, probably the most yacht-friendly place in the Pacific. Other than Suva, Musket Cove was our only other stop in Fiji, for sentimental reasons. It was strange to realise that on our last visit we were guests in the resort, and now we were the seasoned sailors standing at the bar telling stories and hopefully inspiring other wannabe cruisers.